answers about bias or lack thereof?
Well, I think it was a very good hearing. I thought the members on both sides of the aisle asked a lot of very good questions. I think on this issue of bias, Mr. Pichai was not very helpful in determining whether or not, when they rely on third parties like the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has labeled some groups that are clearly not racist as being racist, and in fact have been sued by at least one entity and had to pay a multi-million-dollar judgment. That indicates to me that this is a problem that Google is still wrestling with, has not resolved. And when you see the California Republican Party labeled by Google when it says ideology, and they bring up Nazism, or a North Carolina senator when her photograph is placed up below that it says that she's a bigot. These are things that whether it's systemic bias or whether it's simply a flaw in their algorithms is a serious problem that they do need to address. But there were a lot of other issues we talked about today as well.
How does Google square the other perception problem that because its workforce is largely left-leaning, that it is biased no matter what Pichai says?
I think they have to work overtime to gain the confidence of a large percentage of the American population who wants to be assured that when they conduct search or when they search for particular things on YouTube, Google's subsidiary, they're going to get fairly treated and they're going to get unbiased information about what it is they are searching for.
Now, we heard several Republicans say things along the lines of, I don't want to regulate you, but which is it? Do the Republicans want to regulate Google or not?
I think overwhelmingly Republicans do not want to regulate Google, but the problem they find themselves in, Google does, is that they have an exemption under the law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that allows them to censor objectionable material without facing the kind of liability laws that others, for example, organizations that they rely upon, are subject to. And just like your news organization or a radio station or a newspaper are subject to those libel laws and can be held liable for falsehoods, this exemption that technology companies have, given the fact that they've moved from simply providing a platform on which anybody can post whatever they want to and people can look at it, and therefore they're saying, well, we're like a phone company, we can't control what people do over our system. They've now become editors of that content, and therefore I think the Congress does need to take a close look at how these companies are regulating themselves. I'm not, again, I'm not saying that the government should regulate them, but if they are subject to libel laws, you don't need regulations, because I can assure you that media companies that are subject to libel laws take great pains to make sure that they're not sued for libel. If that same standard were applied to these technology companies, that might be a self-regulatory influence.
So if Democrats brought antitrust legislation, how do you imagine Republicans would respond?
Well, I think you'd have to see what the legislation does. Our antitrust laws are important with regard to Google because they control about 90% of the searches in this country. I think that YouTube has about 75% of the adult population and close to 95% of the 18 to 24-year-olds using it. So they are definitely an important market power. They've grown to that position because they have provided services that people want and people need. And when you go in and try to use the antitrust laws, I'm not opposed to doing that, but you have to do it in a way that takes great pains to make sure that you don't have a result that takes away from people the kinds of things that they count on for Google to provide them. The other thing I think that this hearing helped with the American consumer was to make them more painfully aware than they may already be about just exactly how much overwhelming information Google has about you. If you have an Android device on your person, and a majority of Americans do, they know when you bend over. They know when you go from the first floor to the second floor. They know the temperature in the room that you're in, and you couple that with all of the information they gain by the things that you search for. They know a tremendous amount about people, and they have to work overtime, as I say, to make sure that they continue to have the trust of the American people. And I think they're losing that right now, and I think that's why, after months and months and months of trying, we were fortunate that their CEO, Sundar Pichai, did agree to come forward and talk to us about all of this.
So where do you think Republicans and Democrats might actually be able to find common ground when it comes to legislating big tech in a new Congress?
Check 1, 2.
Well, it might be around examining how Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It might be around some antitrust law. I think we're too new into this to know where that consensus might develop. There certainly was a lot of consensus and concern about the fact that Google is right now in discussions with the Chinese government about entering into their market, a market that they withdrew from in 2010, re-entering that market with technology that would allow the Chinese government to censor and gather information that Americans would be very appalled about if they tried to do the same thing in the United States. That kind of double standard is concerning. But again, their competitors are in that Chinese market, so they're trying to figure out how they can do that in a way that still allows them to uphold their American ideals of free speech and privacy and so on that one would be concerned about in doing business in China. I think that they need to be very careful before they enter into any kind of agreement to get into that market.
Now, Facebook and Twitter have gotten a disproportionate amount of the criticism when it comes to meddling disinformation in the United States in U.S. elections. What do you think Google's role in, preventing the spread of misinformation should be?
Well, how you conduct a search can be very, very influential in terms of what information you have and how you go about the decision-making process of what candidate to vote for or what information you're going to rely upon. So when you type in a search term in Google, it immediately starts giving you suggestions, 3, 4, 5 suggestions right below the search bar. And those have been shown by some studies to be biased. Now, if indeed that's the case, Google needs to reevaluate that to make sure that when people do that, they're getting a fair sampling of the information they need. Then, once the search is conducted and they produce information, how they put it up in front of the viewer, I know they're a company that wants to monetize the information they have and therefore make as much revenue from advertising as possible, but they have to balance that against their responsibility to provide balanced information to their